Welcome back. You're in the Politbureau. Violence in the plastic strike has escalated as the deadlock over wages has entered its 10th week. 2 people have already lost their lives as government has still failed to intervene in the impasse. Industry representatives have condemned the violence, arguing that their current offer that lifts the lowest paid general workers' wage to 43 rand per hour and the highest paid skilled worker to 77 an hour, working a 40-hour week.
It's a very bad patch as we speak with the load shedding because our industry needs to run continuously. You can't have any interruptions. So from that point of view, that is what our industry can afford. And we do believe it's a decent offer. This is the norm. It actually seeks to suggest that without violence we can't achieve anything. It also seeks to suggest that South Africa accepts that the strike needs to be violent in order to achieve anything.
Even though the strike has turned violent, NUMSA, the union leading the industrial action, and their federation SAFTU still believes this matter has become a life and death one.
Employers Association is wanting to withdraw from the Metal Engineering Industry Bargaining Council. Sometimes the violence associated with the strike speak to the crisis of violence in the society as a whole. So don't look at the issue of the violence associated with the strike in isolation.
So, why are South Africa's industrial relations soaked in blood? And what hope does government have of forging a new social compact alongside labour and business if this is the status quo? Joining us to unpack this, SAFTU General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi. And from our Durban studio, we're joined by Bukani Mngoma, a labour analyst. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on Politbureau, Mr. Vavi. Let's start off by asking, why are unions not taking responsibility for the carnage that has befallen a lot of strike action over the past couple of years? This being a case in point, really. I mean, you continue to believe that, while it's regrettable people have died, this is still a matter of life and death.
Well, the strike in the plastic industry is a matter of life and death for us. In the trade union movement, if the employers were to succeed to ride off that strike and impose the 20 rand an hour and pull out of the Metal Engineering Industries Bargaining Council and to basically introduce a two-tier labor market system by cutting the wages and conditions of workers in the rural areas by 10%, surely that will be a reversal of all of the gains that NUMSA members have gained over a period of 20 years of protracted struggles, and to set at least a bar that seeks to protect the workers from super exploitation in the metal industry.
But the necessity, though, to turn to violence to make sure that workers' voices are heard.
That's a separate issue. I'm just saying that the strike of the plastic workers organized by NUMSA is a very legitimate struggle. We as SAFTU calls on all workers in the rest of the economy to understand that if NUMSA members lose that strike, then every other employer will start attacking all of the other bargaining councils everywhere else. They will try to pull out, they will weaken, and with an intention of collapsing the bargaining strategies or bargaining structures, with the view of returning us back to the darkest days of colonial era, where workers were not bargaining but were begging for any pittance that the employers can offer. So it's a very important struggle. Please, workers, demonstrate the meaning of this international slogan of workers: an injury to one is an injury to all. Support NUMSA members involved in that plastic strike.
So, Mr. Vavi, we'll get to the workers that actually died as a result of the strike in a moment, but I'm going to bring the labour analyst in from Durban. Mr. Mngoma, why are our industrial relations soaked in blood? Is this just something that we have to get used to in South Africa, or has it come to a point where the relations between government, business and labour are at such a low point that we can't expect anything else?
Well, I think I do not subscribe to the generalization that strikes in South Africa are violent, because that is not born out of any empirical evidence. In fact, if you look at the recent annual report submitted by the Department of Labour to Parliament, the department acknowledged that in the last 10 years, there has been a marked drop in the number of strikes. And secondly, that those strikes that are actually continue, but they actually get resolved orderly. So to generalize that strikes are violent, I don't think it's going to be fair. But what I do agree is that the few strikes that tend to be violent, they then get more publicity, and as a result, it feeds into the narrative that worker strikes are generally violent. So that's why I'm saying, because if you were to compare what happened between, in fact, just before the democratization and after democratization, you realize that in fact the degree of violence in strikes has actually decreased because of what we call the constitutionalization of the right to strike. Because one of the reasons why strikes in the apartheid era tended to be violent was that workers did not have the constitutional right to strike. It means that they were not protected. So they had freedom to strike, meaning that they were free to strike, but it did not come with a protection against dismissal. Having constitutionalized the right to strike, the expectation obviously is that there needs to be a reduction in the number of violent strikes. So that's why I'm saying, yes, there are violent strikes, and I think unions need to be more vocal in distancing themselves against the acts of those individuals, because they cannot denounce them just because they've committed acts of violence, but at the same time want to profit from the benefit of a strike. So I think unions need to have a policy that basically states exactly what is it that they will do in the event that some of their members commit acts of violence. But generally, the strikes in South Africa, in fact, I would even say that the service delivery process in South Africa are more violent than the strikes that we see by workers, because a number, in fact, an overwhelming majority of strikes are actually resolved peacefully. In fact, some of them don't even get to the point of disputes or CCMA or even bargaining council.
Mr. Ngoma, the fact of the matter, though, is that people are still losing lives, and the argument would be that one life lost is one life too many. I'm going to come back to you now, Mr. Vavi. You're talking about an injury to one being an injury to all. The security guard that was doused with petrol in Satellite during this plastic strike was also a worker. Some may argue that unions are not being sympathetic enough to the workers that become collateral damage when strikes do turn violent.
I welcome everything that he's saying, because I think it is good that someone else says this other than me or any other trade unionist in the country. But let's come to the issue that we are raising. Every time there is violence, every time there is a loss of life and destruction of property, including intimidation of non-striking members who don't want to associate themselves with the strike, we never once fail to come out and condemn and call on the law enforcing agencies to do what they ought to do in relation to the people who are involving themselves in those acts of violence. So as a matter of a principle, as a statement, that's where we come. We don't see any role for violence, intimidation, distraction in a strike, because they intend, those type of actions tend to defocus the public away from the legitimate demands workers are pursuing and focus them on the acts of what I think your other guest is correctly pointing out is a small act of violence and intimidation.
Mr. Vavi, there's a 2012 Constitutional Court ruling which states that the organizers of a strike action, of industrial action, are ultimately responsible for the outcomes of that when it comes to damaging property and other outcomes regarding death and destruction. So do you take it on board that when a strike does turn violent, it's not good enough to just simply blame it on agent provocateurs or a strike breaking down in terms of order?
And by the way, if you could only be aware that the courts and the employers have been using that constitutional court judgment every time there is evidence that the union or its members are responsible for the acts of violence, unions get huge fines at times that cripple them altogether. But we must situate the discussion properly, in my view. Look, we have a history here. In our view, imperialism is a violent system. Colonialization of the South African state that didn't exist before was a violent act. The imposition of capitalism itself regenerates violence every day because it is based on a system of mainly imposition of stealing of what do not belong to the people who are imposing the system.
Mr.
So we must situate the fact that in South Africa, we are a very, very violent nation in general.
Mr. Vavi, we're going to have to leave it at that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Bongani Ngoma, thank you very much for giving your time down in Durban for us this morning on the Politbureau. Coming up next, Spinners and Spanners. Jacob Zuma joins Twitter and breaks the internet.